Hello, how are you doing? And welcome to this month's LGBTQ plus IA history um, club as part of the LGBT plus history month. With us this evening is one of our former volunteers, Michael Laurence, who's going to give us a presentation on Irish men in London's queer underworld. As you know, our project, the LGBTQ plus Heritage Project, is part of the Rainbow Project, Here Am I, and Cara Friend, and very kindly funded by the National Lottery Heritage Programme. We do our LGBT history clubs in conjunction with the Linen Hall Library. So you're all very welcome tonight. And if you have any wee questions, if you would put them into the chat and we can get them later. For now, if you would just put yourselves on mute, that would be appreciated. Thank you. And now I'm just going to hand you over to Michael.
Yes, Grant, I'll crack on. Yes, you're all very welcome. I'm very happy to be giving a talk here. As Mary Ellen said, I used to be a volunteer back during the pandemic, but the extent of my participation was mainly recording Richard O'Leary speak and making Instagram posts, and even that became too much for me, so I ended up leaving. So yes, today I'm going to be talking about the importance of London in Irish queer culture, and on the other side of that coin, the importance of Irish men in London's queer subcultures, from around the late 19th century up to the Second World War, around the Second World War. And I'm going to mainly focus on the criminal aspects of London and of Ireland. I know that's sort of an arbitrary distinction at this time period because all same-sex activity between men was criminal. But I'm going to mainly focus on sex work and blackmail and the dangers of London that was kind of recreated in Irish queer culture. I'm going to do that by talking about 3 men involved in criminal cases at various points in the 19th and 20th centuries, involving the London Irish or London in some way. I just want to highlight before I start that this is very much research in progress, especially when I get to the last case that I'm talking about. I only just discovered this case a few months ago, and I haven't had, unfortunately, that much time to work on it. I'm very eager to get back to London to see what else I can dig up about it. Yes, let's just crack on. So the first subject I'm going to talk about, which a few of you might have already heard about, is and before I start, I'm a PowerPoint loather, and you'll tell it. You can tell I dislike PowerPoint greatly, but I've put something up there for people to look at. But yes, the first subject I'm going to talk about is the relatively infamous Jack Saul. So he was born Dublin Jack, that's what he was later known as. Sorry, he was born, he later was known as Dublin Jack. He was born as Johann or John Saul in 1857, just off of Kevin Street, surrounded by Dublin's working class tenements. He, like many poor Catholic boys in Dublin, seemed to have spent most of his days out on the streets, and as a young man, Saul would have likely spent some time wandering around the Monto. That was Dublin's small red light district known for rowdy soldiers and sex workers, the two professions not being mutually exclusive. The latter trade, sex work, is something that Saul would pick up himself and receive a good bit of historical renown for it. He would become a Mary Ann, a Victorian term for a rent boy or a prostitute in the 19th century. This was not particularly uncommon among urban working class youths at this time. Wealthy men found no trouble in finding a handsome young lad to spend the night with or to dip off down an alleyway with. In Dublin, these men often had a variety of day jobs: amateur actors, coopers, hairdressers, etc. And while money was part of these exchanges, it's worth mentioning that many of these sex workers were not opposed to sleeping with men for free, which may prompt us to reconsider how they conceived of sex and money. But that's a theme for another talk. In 1875, when Saul was around 17, he made the acquaintance of Martin Oran Kerwin, who's just on the left there. He would have been quite a bit older at this point than when the picture was taken. He was a well-respected soldier and a Freemason and a minor aristocrat coming out of Galway. He certainly wasn't Saul's standard John. He liked to take boys out in the town. He would take them to the Gaiety Theatre and Botanical Gardens at Glasnevin. By walking around with Kerwin, Saul got the urban passport. he was able to cross the class boundaries of Dublin without rousing any suspicion as a working class youth. At this time, Curwen might have introduced Saul to Dublin's young but growing queer underworld, taking him to musical parties hosted by Gustavus Cornwall, the chief secretary of the GPO on the right. So at these parties, you had a handsome young man named George Taylor, who would be singing, having just accompanied Cornwall to a concert. And then perhaps after that fairly respectable party died down, Cornwall and Curwen were, after all, quite a bit older at this point than a lot of the men attending these parties. Saul might have slipped away with some of the other boys to a bitches' ball, which was run out of Ballsbridge. It was run at Clyde Road. So this was a drag party hosted by the young son of a baker named Malcolm Johnston, where Taylor would transform from the illustrious, from the kind of normal medical student that he was to the illustrious Maid of Athens. And he would continue to entertain guests, probably by singing, joining such characters as Mary the Melt, Lady Constance Clyde, and the Marchioness of Dame Street. And I've seen Dame Street, and I don't think that's a particularly impressive title. Saul, too, may have had a feminine persona. It's recorded in a later text that was named Eveline, which is important because after this party, Saul may have wiped off his makeup, if he was wearing any, and go to Rathmines, where he would slip into the curiously named Eveline's Bower, which was the back room of a tea and wine shop run by James Pillar. This back room was essentially just a smoke-filled room filled with a few beds, for good measure, where you could always find rent boys or soldiers. Pillar had something of a fetish for soldiers. I'd wager that it was from Pillar that Saul heard the stories of Fanny and Stella, the two cross-dressers that were arrested in 1870 and effectively managed to use camp as a way to get out of their crime. He would have also heard stories about the sexual wonders of London, the speed and the anonymity and the sheer number of men that you can meet in a day. Pillar had a list of names of men in London who were queer in some way, and he would give this list of names to anyone he knew that was traveling to the English capital, which may kind of shine light on the next step of Saul's journey. In 1878, Saul was arrested, not for soliciting or for buggery, but for burglary. It is almost certainly some kind of misunderstanding because he was trying to get into his place of work after hours, which was a house on Harcourt Street where he worked as a servant. No charges were pressed, and it says here felony coat and cap. I think they were later proven to belong to him. But, you know, it ended up with him losing his job anyway. And maybe not completely, you know, above table. It's worth mentioning that the name below him, Will Clark, was the name of his friend. It was Mary the Melt, who I mentioned earlier, who was a little bit more openly unsavory than Jack Saul. He was a known blackmailer, and generally sort of very much playing for money. Yes, so no charges were pressed, but it did result in him losing his job, and I think this may have been the final push for him to emigrate, to go to London, which he did in 1879. His life in London was very colourful. He seems to have supported himself primarily with sex work, living on a house on Leal Street in Soho. His experiences in Dublin with Curwen, Cornwall, and Pillar seemed to determine the type of men that he would go for. He wanted wealthy, the potentially aristocratic was ideal. He wanted more than a few shillings. He wanted to live that high life that Curwen had showed him. I'm not sure if he ever got to again, but this was London. It was fast, it was blurring, it was violent, and it was the perfect place for Saul to ply his trade. He's often accredited with the creation of the pornographic novella, The Sins of the Cities of the Plain, published 2 years after he arrived in London. The book claims to be the recollections of a Mary Ann named Jack Saul, who has an Adonis-like figure and is always ready for a lark with a free gentleman. The book is filthy. It puts John Waters' kind of early films to shame in the terms of the kind of ridiculous or the comical depravity. But there is some contention over whether or not Saul actually wrote this book. It's more likely that if he did, it was part of a collaboration with more kind of like prominent writers of Victorian pornography like William Lazenby or James Campbell Reddy. Still, the novella hinted at a sexual geography of London based around Leicester Square and Piccadilly Circus, which titillated and shocked a small, likely already in the know Victorian audience. So Paul was a self-professed talent when it came to sex work. He frequently went on about how good he was at it and how it was the only job he could do. Unfortunately, talent gets people talking, and in 1884, back in Dublin, people were talking about him. The social network that he moved through as a young man had been exposed by nationalist journalists with an axe to grind against Dublin Castle. This was the infamous Dublin Castle scandal of 1883 and 4, involving Cornwall, Kerwin, and a higher up in the RIC named James Ellis French. A few of Saul's rent boy friends had dropped his name a few times too many, and he was retrieved from London to give a statement about his connections with Cornwall and Kerwin. But what he actually says to the police when he's questioned is completely unknown because it wasn't used in the trial. So that hints to me that it was either too salacious to be voiced in the trial, or he just simply did not say anything that damned Kerwin or Cornwall. He never really had any connection with French that is apparent. But yes, there's no way to tell. The original copy of the deposition was destroyed in the Four Courts fire of 1922. As far as I've looked, because they've recently done a lot of restoration work, finding copies in other archives. There was no other copy of Saul's deposition. Saul was inevitably allowed to go free, which I imagine surprised even him. And Cornwall and Kerwin were convicted, but they managed to appeal their sentence. It was unfortunately James Pillar, the Rathmines-based merchant who really had no connection to Dublin Castle, that was the sacrifice here. He received a horrible 20-year sentence in prison for buggery. He died there in 1894. So this actually wouldn't be Saul's last scandal, but it would be his last Irish one. Saul continued to live in London as a professional prostitute, in his own words, whose character had been destroyed by years of sex work, leaving it as the only work that he could do. In 1889, he becomes embroiled in the Cleveland Street scandal, where he was found to be living in a brothel that catered to the wealthy and the aristocratic queer men of London. But, he escapes once again after brazenly telling the court what he does, why he does it, and the court, baffled, just didn't know what to do with him. So he's let go once again. So this young sex worker from Dublin shocked the British public in his boldness, and through his pornography and his testimony made people aware of the sort of things that went on the streets of London. It was practically advertisement for him. Why he does it, or he clearly left an impression with people too, as all right, so this picture is, this bust was found in a Parisian flea market just in 2020, and it's dated to 1890. It's paper mache. The hair is photoshopped on. The original bust is bald. And on the underside of it, it says Jack Saul, 1890. I do not think this is Jack Saul, but his sole biographer, Glenn Chandler, who is coincidentally the creator of Taggart, he swears up and down this is Jack Saul. I just include it because it's horrifying. I think it's an awful picture. But if it is genuine, you can see the impression that Saul left on people. Yes. Sex life has a shelf life, or sex work has a shelf life. And as Saul grew older, he felt compelled to return to Dublin. He could no longer make the same money as he could as a handsome young man. So in his 40s, he comes back to Dublin. He rejoins his family rather seamlessly. It's my hunch that he sends money back to his mother and later his brothers, as many Irish migrants tend to do at the turn of the century and well into the 20th century. But yeah, so he rejoins his family. He gets a job as a butler, and in 1904 he dies of tuberculosis at around, I think, 47 or something. And here is his grave. He's buried in a very small headstoneless plot in Glasnevin with his mother, father, and his grandmother. So, this may challenge what we may think about yes, he was a sex worker and he was a well-known sex worker. It was printed in the newspapers over and over again. But that didn't mean that he was alienated by his family. Rather, he was able to come back to Dublin and he's buried with his family now. For Saul, London was a place of opportunity. It was somewhere that would facilitate his sex work and arguably allow him to live a queerer life. But not everyone could navigate the dangers of London as well as Saul. Not everyone could avail of the anonymity and the speed of London. In fact, the fact that Saul had been brought back from London to give testimony against the perverse and the morally bankrupt men of Dublin Castle only confirmed the fears or the myths of Irish nationalists that London was a den of vice and perversion, and through British rule, it was infecting Ireland. Saul was a good Catholic lad who was corrupted by these British perverts insofar as nationalist critics concerned. Saul was Catholic, but he wasn't as Catholic as my next subject, who was called James O'Connor. O'Connor was born in Sunday's Well in Cork, and he was educated at Castleknock College, which was a Catholic boys' school just outside of Dublin that was seen as something as a gateway to Maynooth and a life dedicated to the church. They're still quite proud of their Catholic heritage and their roots. You can see a picture of their chapel on the right there. But O'Connor, despite being a devout Catholic, did not go the way of Maynooth. Whatever he did through his life, which is mostly unknown, it ended up with him on Aston's Quay in Dublin, arrested for attempted buggery on a young man. O'Connor professed his innocence, and when that failed, he insisted upon his good character instead. He considered himself different from most other convicts. Indeed, he was middle class. His occupation was listed as an insurance agent, which stands out against the labourers and the soldiers that made up most of the prison records for buggery and gross indecency in Ireland. However, detectives quickly pointed out that he only worked intermittently as an insurance agent, and rather he spent most of his time living off the charity of friends and acquaintances. The Dublin Metropolitan Police described O'Connor as a man of intemperate and dirty habits, and highlighted, apropos of not much, that he had actually been spending 5 years living in England, but would or could not tell the police where or why he had moved. And so the police concluded that he must have been arrested and imprisoned there, despite there being no records of an arrest in England. So here we see this legacy of suspicion of England, the idea that someone of O'Connor's character living in England being a cause for suspicion. O'Connor served his time noisily. He complained incessantly to anyone that would listen, protesting his charge, the conditions of his cell, the food, the activities, the stationery that he had to write his letters of complaint on. The only person that he wrote to more than the Dublin Prison Board to complain was a Catholic priest from Mill Hill, London. That may explain why, when O'Connor was given the choice of being let out of prison in Dublin or having transport arranged to elsewhere in Britain, he elected to go to London in 1915. All convicts were given the choice of being released from imprisonment elsewhere in Britain, but very few people actually availed of it. So yes, in 1915, he arrives at London. He enjoyed his freedom about as much as he enjoyed prison life. He was indignant at a formality in the law where you have to continue to report your address. It isn't really a formality, an aspect of law where you have to continue to report your address, location, and occupation to the police, wherever you are. The police would ask him about the nature of his conviction, and he would have to explain. He also was obliged to tell his landlord and his prospective employers, which, according to himself, caused no shortage of trouble. He wrote to the Prisons Board demanding that his obligations be waived because of his good behavior while he was on the inside, to which the board reminded him that he had been an absolute nightmare while in prison. Then O'Connor kind of switches his tone and he starts to plead with them. He says that he just wants to move on. He may have just wanted to use London like many queer men did to disappear. It's also mentioning, just as an aside here, so 1915, this is taking place in the middle of World War And O'Connor is writing to the prisons board claiming that he has a great idea and he's planning to get work in the war. At this point, he is 60, he's around 65, 64, 65. So he isn't going to fight. Instead, he writes to his MP and he tells them of a wonderful idea that he has, that he wants to go to the Western Front and install mirrors along the trenches. And the mirrors will catch sunlight and, in his own words, dazzle the enemies by natural means. Funny enough, it didn't happen. They didn't really go for it. And when this kind of fell through, he wrote to the prison board saying that if he couldn't find work in London, he would return to Dublin in a fortnight, which I think the prison board read as a threat, because they upped his gratuity when they heard this. They said, no, you can stay in London. We'll give you an extra £1 per month, or something, or some such. But yes, he wouldn't actually return to Dublin until 1920, because in 1916 he is arrested and convicted again for sodomy. Evidently, he wasn't able to negotiate the dangers of London's queer underworld as well as Saul could, and it ended up with him in Parkhurst Prison on the Isle of Wight. When released, he goes back to Dublin, and he's nearly 70 now. He is very active in the Catholic Church on Westland Row, and asked the prison board if the tone of his letter is much more deflated and tired at this point, but he asked them if he could just report his location to his local priest instead, or the local Catholic society or a Catholic prisoner society. The prison board sent him back a very terse letter, basically saying, no, the law must take its course. And so here we see the Dublin police still insisting to be kept up on the movements of this 70-year-old man after he was arrested in London. So yes, London was a place of opportunity for Saul, but it was a place of danger for O'Connor. His middle-class background and his religious upbringing made him struggle with the matters of sexual stigma more than the working-class Saul did. In one of his letters, he says when he's answering the police's questions, he's being trapped in the past. He describes being miserable, struggling with the stigma of his recent troubles. And then he actually writes, I cannot forget that I'm supposed to be something that I am not. So this is interesting. It's quite anachronistic for the time. O'Connor's an outlier in how much he's writing about the stigma of imprisonment in Ireland, especially for same-sex crimes. And you know, it's something you would maybe expect to see in a book by Peter Wildeblood or Rupert Croft Cook, where they're using their experiences in prison to lead to a change in the law. It's not something that a lot of men were saying at this point in time about their imprisonment, especially in Ireland. Yes. So his relatively wealthy upbringing might have stunted his ability to engage with the police as well as Saul could. Saul was able to talk his way out of conviction twice, potentially more times. And my next subject is able to do the same. This isn't him, actually. But before I talk about him, I'm going to talk about an Englishman named Harry Raymond. So Raymond was born in 1900 in Bristol. And as a young man, he found himself on the West End, or in the West End on stage. And he played a few gangsters in crime thrillers. During this time, he seems to have developed a pretty serious gambling addiction. And so to make up the money that he was losing, he turns to blackmail. So his first few attempts in 1927 are amateurish and desperate. They're very cocky, but he gets away with them. He gets away with a warning from the local judge, or from a judge. And then in 1933, he tries again. He tries to blackmail one of his theatrical friends. As you can imagine, in theatrical circles in London, you have no shortage of men to blackmail for reasons of same-sex desire or relations. And this one ends up landing him in prison for 5 years. So he ends up landing in Maidstone Prison, where he makes the acquaintance of two quite possibly Irish men. I haven't been able to find them just yet, called Joseph Kinsella and David Baird. They had run a blackmailer's ring before Raymond had landed in prison, and they had been caught and put away. And when in prison, it seems that the three exchanged notes on how best to blackmail someone over a period of time who is the best target, and they make a plan that when they're let out, they're going to make another blackmailers gang, and they're going to do things differently. Raymond was released by 1937, and he moved in with his sister and her husband. The husband's name was Leslie Edmund Townsley, a young man from County Derry in Northern Ireland who was raised in Belfast. And that's about it. The only Ulster connection that I was able to drag out of this subject. So Townsley was aware of Raymond's crime and his homosexuality. Raymond wasn't just a pragmatic blackmailer. So he agreed to let Raymond live in his house, but only if he went straight, and I don't know how straight he was talking about. Raymond promised that he was done with blackmail, and within a few months, he had set up a blackmailers gang yet again. In fact, he was actually using Townsley's business note paper to write threatening and pleading notes to his victims, as we can see here. Townsley worked at the Carr & Co. biscuit company, which you may recognize from grandmother's sewing kits. They made very ornate Victorian tin boxes for biscuits. So using money that he just seems to conveniently have found, Raymond moved out of his sister's house and buys a cafe on Leal Street, just doors away from where Jack Saul lived. I think the cafe was number 2. Jack Saul lived at number 6. But yes, he calls it Filari, later calls it Harry's Cafe. Very creatively named. And this would be his base of operations while he organized his blackmailers gang. He would end up keeping a ledger of all the men he was blackmailing and which of his boys, his gangsters, was doing the heavy lifting, so to speak. So his gang, very much the brotherhood of evil twinks of London. They were young, handsome, often clever and witty, or at least they were able to bat their eyes. They were, like Saul, able to pick a wealthy and potentially aristocratic man out of a crowd. In Leicester Square, Piccadilly Circus, or Haymarket near the Covent Garden was their most often hunting grounds. So they would approach and entice the man into a conversation, and often it would not go beyond a conversation on the first meeting. But the young men would often leave with the man's address or their phone number so they could make contact later. They often played the long game. Some of the victims spent months getting to know the boys before the trap was finally shut. That's right. Yes. So one of Raymond's boys, in fact, his favorite, I would argue, was Danny O'Neill. So in 1937, he was 22 and he's part of London's prominent Irish community. He was born in London and as John O'Neill in Bethnal Green. His father was also from London. But and I'm not really sure when they emigrated, but I'm convinced that they are Irish because you see here in the father's World War I service record that he had tattoos of a shamrock and 98, which I assume is 1798. Although now I'm looking at this, it's like awful handwriting. I could be telling you guys anything. I could be saying he walked around with the shillelagh and sang "Oh Danny Boy" across the streets of Camden Town. But yes, you'll have to believe me, it says Shamrock. So yeah, the O'Neills are part of this English-born Irish migrant community that worked to maintain their heritage and national identity at the time, largely due to alienation that they already felt within English society. In the 1920s and the 1930s, Irish people are generally disdained. In sort of an echo of history that we're currently facing now, the English thought that they had sorted out the Irish question only for the border to come roaring back. And so, you know, IRA agitation had managed to effectively piss off a bunch of people in England, which generally led to grief for the Irish communities in English cities. But in the absence of anything like a diary, I can't actually say to what extent John O'Neill or Danny O'Neill felt Irish. But I can just kind of assume from context clues here that he certainly didn't feel English. Right. So yes, O'Neill was part of this blackmailers gang, but he had a very privileged position within it. He was Raymond's, dare I say, boyfriend. So they slept in the same bed, although O'Neill would later swear up and down that no impropriety ever took place, that nothing ever happened. And And O'Neill was given plenty of gifts by Raymond. I think, in fact, he received a car from Raymond that he would use to drive Raymond about London, even as far as Cornwall and the Isle of Skye, to reach Raymond's blackmail victims. Officially, O'Neill was Raymond's chauffeur. So the methods of the blackmail gang varied from time to time. Sometimes they worked quite quickly. They would meet a man who was sitting alone at a cafe or a bar, and they would wait around social clubs and chat up men as they came out. Then they would arrange to meet in the next few days, and when they got to this hotel room or apartment, they would have some fun, only for it to be cut off when Harry Raymond arrives, bursting in, shouting something like, "What do you think you're doing with my little brother?" Or one of my favorites is, "Are you aware that this man is a sodomite?" Which they're naked in bed together. I think he's managed to sleuth it out. At first, he would appear hell-bent on reporting the man to the police, but would later open himself up to bribes. Of course, it never ends with one bribe. Some of these men pay £5,000 of their money. That's money in 1937 for what is essentially 2 months of peace before Raymond calls them up again. Other times, I'll just go back to this because this is an example of it. Other times, they take months and they're very subtle about it. So this is the use of the hard luck story, which the Irish became very well known for in the 1930s. So we can see here in this note, so this was actually unsuccessful. This didn't work. But one of the boys is pretending that he had a gambling addiction and was in debt to a music hall. And he pleaded with his victim, in this case it was Mr. Frederick Simmons, who ran a fox farm on the Isle of Skye, to send him money so that he could pay them off. This worked for a while, and when they stopped paying up, that's when Raymond comes in with a threat. It was a good system. Usually it made Raymond and O'Neill a lot of money. In this case, though, Raymond really, really screwed it up because they all used aliases. All of the boys had a different alias for each man they were blackmailing. And when Raymond arrives at this man's house, he forgets the alias that the boy used. And so he essentially rattles off 3 different names before the man says, "I don't know any of them. Who are these people that you're talking about? I didn't do anything with them." And the funny thing is that at this point, the boy had not yet successfully seduced Mr. Simmons. So Raymond was accusing him of committing a crime that he didn't commit with a boy that doesn't exist. And he eventually gets very flustered and embarrassed. He was an actor by trade, and it was essentially he'd forgotten his line. And he kind of shirks away from Simmons' house and then returns to London. Simmons reports this to the police, and the police say, "Oh, we think this is in connection with a known sodomite in London," and the man hangs up the phone and refuses to deal with it anymore. Yes, that's the example of the hard luck story that some of the boys would use. And it all came crashing down due to Raymond's greed. He ended up bragging at his cafe that he had made £60,000 off of blackmailing various men in a few months with an officer of the law, with a police officer sitting just a few chairs away. But at this point, he had made a lot of enemies. So I said it was because of his greed. In his trying to drain out as much money of his victims as he could, he actually ended up blackmailing his brother-in-law, and thus incurred the wrath of the Northern Irish Ma. So one particularly damning tip-off was that of Martha Townsley, Leslie Edmund Townsley's mother. So she is from around Coleraine, County Derry, and she just visits Leslie Townsley a few months before Raymond gets put away. And she notices that her son is depressed and worried to death over things, and she needles him about it until he tells her that he's being blackmailed. I don't know what he's being blackmailed over. He never told his mother. It's unlikely to me that he had sex with any of Raymond's boys. He knew what Raymond did. He knew Raymond's MO. He wouldn't have been so stupid, even if he wanted to, even if he was that way inclined, to sleep with any strangers. It's more likely that he was being blackmailed about an extramarital affair, or maybe even being threatened that Raymond was going to go to the police and accuse him of blackmail because, again, the threatening notes were written on his business cards and they weren't signed with a name. So either way, Townsley's mother returns back to Coleraine. She said she's not going to stand for this, and she writes a letter to Scotland Yard. She tries at least to be subtle. She uses a fake name and a fake address, but then she says, "My name is Anne McLean. My son Leslie Esmond Townsley." And so the police were able to work their way back from that. She warns the police about Harry Raymond, says that he is a blackmailer and that he's blackmailing her son, and explained that instead of, trying to, absolve her son of any crime, he just says that her son is a clever young man who is always honest in his dealings and is second to none as a conscientious worker. And she calls him very noble. It's very touching. She sings his praises for around 3 pages. And then she signs off with, "Surely you can understand a mother's feelings for her son." She asked them to keep it all confidential. It didn't work. The police received this letter and brought Martha and her son in for questioning in their connection with Harry Raymond, who at this point they already had a couple of tips about. So in the months after this, the trial is wrapped up when one of the blackmail victims, called Mr. A, agrees to entrap Raymond. He sits with a police officer. He sits at a restaurant with a police officer behind him and essentially entices Raymond to blackmail him. And after that, Raymond is arrested. He's put on trial with a young man called Alfred Bird, and he receives 10 years. Bird receives 2 years. Most of the gangsters, as soon as they hear that the boys, the blackmailers, once they hear that Raymond's arrested, they scatter to the 4 winds. They go underground. But they did manage to catch John O'Neill, or Danny O'Neill, and they brought him in for questioning. And O'Neill escapes conviction because he lies, and he lies expertly so. You can see the sort of quick wit in the deposition that he's coming up with these lies off the top of his head. You can see the interrogating officer at the start kind of doubt him and eventually come round to what he's saying. And the best thing is he's lying through his teeth. It's very much oh, no, I was just a chauffeur. Oh, was he a blackmailer? You're telling me I've been working for a blackmailer all these years? Oh my God, I asked him once what he did, but he just told me to mind my business. A sodomite, you say? Well, I mean, he tried it on with me once, but I wouldn't stand for it. It's very much this. He really denies absolutely everything. And he manages to convince the police that he was just Raymond's chauffeur, despite evidence of the other testimonies saying that O'Neill occasionally involved himself in the blackmail. But they didn't manage to convince him. He didn't manage to convince the interrogating officer that he wasn't queer. They concluded that he was almost certainly a sodomite who slept with Raymond. But they had already got their pound of flesh. Several officers for catching the infamous Harry the Vain, as Raymond later became known, were promoted, and they just let O'Neill go. So O'Neill, once again, as we saw with Saul, moves back in with his family. There's no real problem, no real tension there. This is a really bad quality image, my apologies. But he now, in 1939, 2 years after the scandal, is working as a baker's roundsman, a delivery boy. And I do have this mental image of him driving around in the car that Raymond bought him, not a care in the world, just delivering pastries. So yes, that's 3 different stories from 3 different times in kind of London history, and it is just a taste of Irish men in London and London and Irish culture. London could be a place of opportunity, it could be a place of danger. Indeed, Irishmen worked to provide both that opportunity and that danger. Saul made it a place of opportunity, O'Neill a place of danger, and poor O'Connor and Townsley seemed to just be caught up in the middle of it. This might explain why English queer writers in the 1940s and the 1950s were so eager to point to Irish men as people who prey on homosexuals. Quentin Crisp in the 1960s, reflecting on his life in interwar London, defines the hard luck story as something done by an impecunious Irishman to English queers. Likewise, Gordon Westwood, a sociologist writing about homosexuality in the 1950s, recalls one Englishman responding that he isn't actually afraid of being blackmailed because he doesn't hang around with rough Irish layabouts. Yet, interestingly, another man from that same study says that when he was asked what is your favorite, what's your type of men, he says, "Oh, rough Irish layabouts." So we can see here that Irish men are being feared, but they're also being fetishized. They're being lusted after in London. They make very much a visible part of London street life that is dangerous, but part of that danger is the appeal, or part of the appeal is the danger of these rough Irish layabouts or laborers. So they do have a reputation for engaging in sex work and blackmail, perhaps not unearned throughout the big scandals of the interwar period. And just to tie back to my very original picture that I gave to Mary Ellen to put up as an advertisement, the Marble Arch. This was a known place for Irish sex workers in the interwar period. And in fact, Quentin Crisp makes a very dry comment about assuming that there are maps of the Marble Arch in every public lavatory in Belfast in particular, for whenever a ruined Celt arrives in London so that he may know where to find work. That's me. That's what I've got on Irishmen in London's queer underworld. All wrapped up.
That was great. Like, very interesting. I have one wee quick question, just out of curiosity. Did you see if O'Neill visited Raymond in jail?
Pardon?
Danny O'Neill, did he go visit Raymond in jail?
No, or it's certainly not recorded. I don't have Raymond's prison record, unfortunately. Raymond is let out again in 1945, or around 1944, and he instantly starts blackmailing again. But this time he has a sort of different plan. And this time instead of going around and getting kind of attractive young queer men, he's going around and getting the kind of new first arrivals of the Windrush generation. So people from Jamaica and the Caribbean. And he actually manages to kind of infiltrate and take over. I can't remember. It's called it's called the Philological Kama Society or something, but it's an occultist sexual religion. And so Raymond takes it over, invites in kind of these curious men who are excited about the sexual religion, and essentially gets them to write erotic poetry about wanting to lust after other men. And then as soon as they do that, he starts blackmailing them again. And actually, in the last I hear about him is in 1948, when the police are annoyed because he's fled to Northern Ireland.
Oh, geez.
So I actually don't know what became of Harry Raymond after that.
They actually all have Irish surnames, like I know that you were saying that you weren't sure of Kinsella. Was it a Sean or John Kinsella?
Joseph Kinsella, yeah. I just haven't been able to find him yet, and it's hard because that with the names, some of them can be fourth generation immigrants in England.
Well, we have a couple of comments in the chat there from Kirsty and Rachel, just thanking you and saying how interesting your talk was. Do we have any other comments or questions?
Yeah, sure. I'm Michael. Great to see you again and how busy you've been in your research. Just wanted to ask you, when you said the Irish nationalist politicians seized on these cases and, for political purposes, do you think they really were they only motivated by political point scoring, or were they also privately, genuinely horrified as well? Because on the one hand, you've suggested families weren't too bothered in terms of they seem to accept back their family members, so there might have been a class dimension to that. And on the other hand, you've got another strata of Irish Catholic society which is very outraged. So was that outrage just political, or do you think that was something that was genuinely held? And if so, was there any evidence of that in, say, Catholic religious tracts, or some, complaints about it from theological circles?
Yeah, It's kind of a tough question here. I've read both. So the main two politicians who attacked Dublin Castle were William O'Brien and Tim Healy. I've read both of their memoirs. O'Brien seems to generally disdain the witnesses, and he writes very homophobic things about them. He says that they are hysterical, that they're feminine, that they're or effeminate, and he really paints a bad portrait of them. And Tim Healy doesn't talk about it as much, but he does recall walking with a colleague of his, and this colleague says that, have you ever noticed that all of the blackguards in Dublin are musical? Musical being a coded term for homosexual. And Timothy Healy replies with some snide kind of quote from Shakespeare about those with no music in their hearts are only fit for treachery and treason, or some such. Tim Healy was a kind of old-fashioned liberal. He doesn't seem to be that obsessed with policing what men do, or what queer men do. And it reads to me as if this was an aspect of political opportunism that they didn't even know how far it would go. It's also worth mentioning that William O'Brien's brother-in-law is Marc-André Rafalovich, the famous French sexologist who called for decriminalization. So it does read to me that this was more of a opportunistic thing. As for how generally people felt about kind of same-sex relations, I do think it depends on class. So when in my studies, I think it was I studied 15 men who were put in prison for buggery, gross indecency, and decent assault, some form of same-sex sex crime. And of the 15, only 5 of them took the chance to emigrate. And even those that did emigrate, they tend to come back. They tend not to stay permanently, and they seem to be more motivated by economic reasons. A lot of them continue to talk to their families while in prison. They receive letters, they send letters. So there may be some truth to what, God, I'm going to bring him up again, Oscar Wilde. I always like to exclude Oscar Wilde from talks of queer history just out of a sense of sadistic glee, just to deprive him of his attention. But yeah, Oscar Wilde, when he was put in prison, he said that the poor are essentially kinder than the rich. When someone's put in prison, they just conceive of it as an awful tragedy that happens that is deserving of sympathy and pity rather than stigma. So I do think, for the most part, people in Ireland did not necessarily disdain sex between men. As long, and there is a stipulation, as I'm rambling on, there's a stipulation that as long as you are masculine, of good character, you're a good worker, there's reason to believe that you could get away with having a subtle same-sex relationship in late 19th, early 20th century Ireland. Yes, just speculation at this point.
Very interesting, thank you.
Just like you, anybody else?
No, just when you're saying about the dates, Michael, it's quite interesting because if you're saying early the 1900s to the 20th, I mean, that's sort of in between where the Rising was and then the early 20s when the state was set up. Now, like, I mean, the whole sort of proclamation talks about, equality between peoples and stuff like that. And also, like, shortly after that, then after the treaty and the Civil War, then you had De Valera, and that became like a conservative Ireland. So it's interesting that time frame you're talking about, which it's a bit like, well, for me, I'm thinking like, the Germany in the 30s before the war, where they had like cabaret and all that sort of carry on. So it could be Ireland was on that sort of cusp before it sort of went towards De Valera and all that sort of carry on.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth mentioning, the nationalists tend to soften with how they approach kind of same-sex sex crimes because of Oscar Wilde and Roger Casement. And they really don't know how to deal with that. They sort of didn't realize that was a double-edged sword and it could be turned against them. With Oscar Wilde, they responded to his trials with kind of silence. They didn't really want to cover it that much. And Roger Casement, they refused that those diaries were authentic. But yes, it does tend to be that at that point they're sort of softening up on their stance. They're not really attacking it as super. They're not attacking kind of the queer men as much, but it does ramp up in De Valera's kind of Ireland at one point in 1929, or sorry, it's 1929 or 1932 with the Carrigan Committee report. They recommend the implementation of flogging and the publication of convicts' names and addresses if they're caught having sex with another man, which wasn't taken, interestingly, wasn't actually taken in by De Valera's government. But yes, I see where you're coming from with that.
And that's interesting too, when you consider that some of the people who would have taken part in the uprising in 16 were out LGB people, particularly quite a number of women who would have been captains or whatever kind of thing of different barricades and stuff. Like for instance, Kathleen Lynn, Nuala O'Farrell, so it's quite I suppose though they were more Irish citizens army, and De Valera wasn't.
Yeah, it puts Ireland in a weird place with our kind of like queer history, because other kind of colonial states like India, Bangladesh, even as far as Senegal, they can claim to have had a kind of a rich queer history, which was stamped out by the British. But when we compare, so since gross indecency as a crime was brought in 1885, there were really around 20, or there was around 18 uses of it in the 20 years after it was introduced. And then the 20 years after that, which just so happened, or the 40 years it was introduced, and then in the 20 or 40 years after that, which was the Irish Free State era and the Republic, it was used around 200 times. I'm just vaguely remembering statistics from Averil Earl's Unnatural Offences of English Import. But so it is interesting to see that it was actually the Irish Free State that took an effort to kind of stamp out homosexuality, at least in the first kind of 20 years of its existence, or Irish Free State and Republic.
Yeah.
It's very dour note. It turns out there's one thing we can't blame the English on. It's horrible. It's awful feeling.
Yeah, it's terrible, so it is. Amy's again just thanking you for your presentation. She's just had to go. You know that Amy just had a baby boy?
Yeah, I heard in the, yes, well, congratulations to Amy. 2 months old. Oh.
So any other comments or questions? My goodness, they're a very shy lot tonight.
No complaints from me.
Okay, then it just leaves me to thank you for your presentation, Michael, and to thank
my
you
pleasure.
for turning up and asking some questions, and that it's been very interesting and very worthwhile. And we hope that you will come back and do another one with us and reconsider coming and volunteering with us again.
But we'll see.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Oh.